Hi, and welcome to the first module of the Cloud Practitioner exam course. This is going to be everything you need to know to be able to take and pass the AWS Cloud Practitioner exam. So you have a lot of modules ahead of you. This should be very helpful in your exam preparation. I'm going to go through the course description and everything you need to know in this module, and then we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the concepts that will be covered inside the exam. My name is Jeff Fudge. I will be your instructor on this. I've been using AWS for about 8 to 10 years. I run 3 different AWS user groups. I'm an AWS community builder, and I've helped a variety of companies move to the cloud on AWS, and I use AWS today as a solution architect and as a cloud practice director. So strap in and let's go. Although I'm going to cover all the important things out of this exam guide, I did want to walk through a little bit of what you will find, and I'll put a link to this exam guide in the comments section. But I pulled up the exam guide for the Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. It walks through the response types as you see here, only multiple choice. Could be one multiple choice, could be multiple. It talks about there's 15 questions that aren't scored. Again, we're going to go through this. Talks about the outline. I'll go through this in detail. You'll notice that, roughly each one has about 25% weight. Billing and pricing is the least weighted, so I would spend the least time on that. But we're going to break down these different domains. That's really what the course is going to be all about, covering all of these different topics as you see in the different domains. And based on their weight is how strongly I will focus on each of those domains. Here you see billing and pricing, which is the least weighted domain. They talk about all the things that might be covered, and as you look through this list, that can look pretty daunting. But again, I'm going to cover these during this exam preparation series of videos. And so I would encourage everyone, even if you're taking this video, even if you're watching other videos, just get familiar with the exam guide. Every time you decide to get certified on a different topic, each one is going to have a relatively detailed exam guide, and you want to get familiar with that before you start preparing for the test, and certainly before you take the test. So the exam is going to test knowledge of these various tasks, and this is called out into the exam guide. First, you need to be able to explain the value of the AWS cloud, and that is to say, why are companies moving to the cloud? What is it that it solves? What business pain points, what friction can it eliminate in terms of computing solutions for businesses? So basically, your job is to understand what is it that is motivating companies and businesses across the globe to move to the cloud, and in this instance, AWS specifically. You need to understand the AWS shared responsibility model. So gone are the days where people think, oh, the cloud, I'm sure it's secure, or I'm sure it's more secure than what I am running on-prem, so I can just trust AWS to handle all of my security needs. And instead, as the name implies, it's shared responsibility. So sure, AWS is going to protect their physical data centers. It's going to protect the underlying hardware infrastructure. But you as the AWS user, the AWS consumer, you are still responsible for securing your operating system, securing the perimeter, securing your users and their logins and those protections with complex passwords and MFA, etc. So you need to understand what is it that you are responsible for and what is it that AWS is responsible for. You need to understand security best practices. I work with a lot of AWS customers throughout the week, and you have to make sure that when you move to the cloud, you don't handle security as a day 2 exercise. Oh, it's time to be audited. Let's make sure what we're doing in the cloud is secure. or oh, we've been compromised now. Let's make sure we're secure. You need to be secure when you roll out solutions in the cloud. So the best way to do that is to truly understand security best practices. So as you start using the cloud, you are building those best practices into your AWS environments. Next, you need to understand how the AWS cloud is going to bill you. What are the costs associated? How do those economics compare to running infrastructure on-prem or in a co-located data center? So costs are a big deal. It's so easy to provision resources in the cloud that if you're not careful, you're going to start looking at runaway costs if you don't have a solid governance plan in place. So we're going to, through preparation for this exam, the certification exam, we're going to talk all about the costs and the billing practices. Next, you need to have a pretty good idea of the core AWS services. Maybe not the fringe services, but the common services that most people use. That includes compute, and the compute service really is virtual servers, something to run your applications or your software on. The underlying network services that you clearly need. What are database services available to you? And how do I handle storage? Where do I store my data, my files, my other objects? What are my storage options? And then lastly, you need to identify common use cases. What are some common ways that businesses are leveraging AWS? And you need to be able to spot those use cases. Now let's talk about the test format. First, it's going to be multiple choice and multiple response. What's the difference between those two? Well, multiple choice, given 4 choices, only one can be correct. Multiple response means it's still multiple choice, but there may be more than one answer. AWS on the exam may say pick 2 or pick 3. Those are usually a little more difficult, and just be aware that the difference between right and wrong is often very subjective. And this is probably more true in the more advanced courses, but sometimes multiple answers can make sense. But if they ask which is the most economical or which is the least expensive, that's where sometimes there's a little bit of shades of gray. But the good news is there is no hands-on testing for this. You don't need to understand the AWS portal. It's all going to be either single, multiple choice answers or multiple answers, but still all given in multiple choice format. Next, there are going to be 65 questions. 50 questions are going to directly impact your score. And then there's 15 unscored questions. And those questions are really the questions AWS is testing. They want to see how people respond to those questions. It's how they keep these tests evolving. It's how they ensure that these tests are accurately testing someone's knowledge. Now, you won't know when you take the test which are scored and which are unscored, so you're going to treat all 65 with the same focus, the same attentiveness, because you won't know the difference. But behind the scenes, just know that only 50 are going to count. The cost is $100. I put this in US dollars because I'm here in the United States, but you can do the financial equivalent in your country to understand what the approximate cost is, and a passing grade is 70%. So keep that in mind. It sounds like a low bar, but these tests are not designed to be easy, but as long as you get 70%, you're good, and you will find out your score at within a couple days after taking the test, and you'll find out where you are percentage-wise. There is no penalty for guessing, so there is absolutely no reason for leaving any question unanswered unless you absolutely ran out of time. But you're not punished for guessing, and so when it's multiple choice, a best guess is better than no guess. And then lastly, you will have 90 minutes to complete. I would say until you start taking some of the more complex certification exams, 90 minutes should be fine. For this exam, should give enough time for you to go back, review your answers, Common wisdom is your first answer is almost always the correct one, but I always encourage exam takers to go ahead, review your answers, make sure you didn't misread the question when you answered it the first time around. So now let's talk about the test domains, and I reviewed this briefly when we looked at the exam guide that AWS puts out. So just to reinforce that, the majority of the test, I shouldn't say the majority, but the test domain that has the biggest impact on your score is technology. And so accordingly, I will focus most on those concepts here during this exam. Next is at 26%, cloud concepts, very important, as is security and compliant, so I'll give those equal weighting just behind technology. And then lastly, billing and pricing, that only makes up 16%, still very important, but if you think, boy, okay, I need a 70% as a passing grade, even if you didn't do well in billing and pricing, you're still able to pass the course. And so accordingly, as with the others, I was spending the least amount of time on billing and pricing. Still very important, but from a weighting perspective, it is the least weighted domain. Now let's talk about the individual domains, and this isn't based on the weight that AWS gives these domains. These are going to be reviewed in the order they are in the exam guide. So the first domain is cloud concepts. And here you're working on defining the AWS cloud and its value proposition. Some of the topics and benefits that you'll be talking about or learning about with the AWS cloud are, the security that it offers, the reliability, things like high availability, agility, scalability, pay-as-you-go pricing. All of these things contribute to the value proposition. So again, these are reasons that companies are moving to the AWS cloud, so it's important for you to understand all the benefits. And you'll also be learning about how does AWS allow companies to better focus on business value, business challenges, focusing less on technology, focusing less on the heavy lifting, less on the tasks that are required to keep the lights on, and more on business value. And as someone who's been a CIO in the past, and I've racked and stacked and run data centers, absolutely, AWS helps you put a greater focus on business value, business challenges, differentiating your business, and less on some of the fundamental hardware, maintenance, support, and operational tasks. The second part that you're going to talk about is identifying aspects of the AWS cloud economics that it brings to customers. For instance, what items would be part of a TCO, a total cost of ownership proposal? You're going to understand things like operating expenses or OPEX and how that compares to capital expenses, also called CAPEX. You're going to understand labor costs associated with running your infrastructure on-prem versus the cost of running inside of the AWS cloud. You're going to talk about the impact of software licensing, and you're going to talk about if you move to the cloud, what operations will have reduced costs. If you right-size your infrastructure, if you automate, if you leverage managed services in the cloud. And then lastly, you're going to explain the different cloud architecture design principles. You're going to talk about how you design for failure and how you anticipate failure when you design for the cloud. You don't wait for a failure and then say, well, there's something that we can improve upon. You want to expect failure and design that in from the beginning. I want to talk about how if you decouple components, if you look at on-prem application development, it was a large monolithic application. And as you move to the cloud, they encourage you, they being AWS, encourage you to think more about microservices and having small independent units of work when you design your applications, whether you're using Kubernetes or just microservices. And lastly, they're going to talk about implementing elasticity in the cloud. You know, one of the challenges of on-prem is the fact that you buy hardware, it's good for 5 years, and you try to guess how much hardware you need at the end of that 5-year period. And so this exam is going to cover topics such as how is scalability and elasticity used in the cloud, and how does that benefit you when compared to an on-prem infrastructure. Now let's talk about the second domain, which is security and compliance. First, you're going to talk about the AWS shared responsibility model. And you're going to be able to recognize different elements that relate to AWS's responsibilities. And keep in mind that the amount of responsibility AWS has may depend on the underlying service. For instance, their responsibility for something such as the managed database service, or RDS, relational database service, might be different than if you are running your database on a virtual server known as EC2. And so they're going to walk through, or I'm going to walk through in preparation for the exam, the different layers of AWS responsibilities. And then we're going to dig in a little bit more on the cloud security and compliance concepts. Where do you find AWS compliance information? So if you have to comply with regulation frameworks such as HIPAA for healthcare, or PCI from the payment card industry for the handling of credit card information, we're going to walk through where you can find that compliance information. And then next, we're going to talk about how do you better prepare for compliance? How do you handle encryption so all the data that you are storing, if it's sensitive, even if it's PII or personally identifiable information, names, addresses, social security numbers, email addresses. So we're going to learn how to protect that data with encryption and what your encryption options are. And then we're going to talk about some of the services. How do you audit yourself? How do you monitor to ensure that you're staying compliant with whatever security framework you choose? And next, we're going to understand AWS access management capabilities. We're going to talk about access keys and how you can access AWS remotely, and how you protect using access keys securely. We're going to talk about multi-factor authentication, or MFA. How do you protect from stolen passwords or brute force attempts to log in to your existing AWS user accounts? How do you group accounts used for logins into different groups? How do you assign roles so that you have an administrator role, or let's say you've got a role for your finance users? And we're going to talk about how you set up policies for governance. And last, we're going to talk about root accounts. And if you used or if you viewed my video on using AWS, using that free account tier, we talked about root accounts versus IAM accounts. But we're going to, under 2.3, we're going to talk about how you protect your root account. That is the account that you used when you first created the AWS account. That is the most powerful account. And so, as you might expect, you're going to protect that a little bit more than any other account. And then lastly, we're going to identify resources for security support. We're going to talk about how there are native AWS services that you can use to help ensure your AWS environment is secure. And then we're going to talk about some third-party products available from the AWS marketplace. So here the message is you won't be limited to just what is native to AWS and provided by AWS, but there are also third-party tools that you can leverage to help increase your security posture. We're going to talk about how there's different documentation out there to help you secure your workloads on AWS. And then lastly, we're going to talk about a service called AWS Trusted Advisor that will be kind of your your partner helping you understand on a regular basis, hey, did you know you can do these things a little more securely? And so that trusted advisor is an email that will be sent to you with recommendations, both from a security and a cost optimization perspective. But these are the things we're going to talk about in the second test domain. Now let's talk about the third domain, which is technology. As you might recall, this was the domain that was weighted the heaviest. It was 33% of your overall score. First, let's talk about the methods of deploying and operating in the cloud that you are going to be tested on. So at a high level, they want you to understand the different ways to access AWS, how you can do that programmatically, how you can do that through the console, how you can do that through the command line. Then they're going to talk about the fact that there's different deployment models. You can be all in the cloud and have everything contained in AWS. You could be hybrid. You might have some infrastructure on-prem in a data center or in your office. You might have also some in the cloud, and they talk about that hybrid. Or you might have everything completely on premises and not leverage the cloud today. And the last aspect of 3.1, that section of the domain, is going to be on connectivity. How you can connect through the public internet, through a virtual private network, a VPN. And then we're also going to talk about there's a AWS Direct Connect option. That is a dedicated circuit. It does not rely on the public internet, and that is a direct circuit from your business to AWS. Next, we're going to talk about how the AWS global infrastructure was designed. We're going to talk about things such as regions, availability zones, also called AZs, and edge locations. And we're going to talk about how you can use the concept of availability zones to eliminate the potential for a data center going out and knocking your business offline, and how you can use multiple data centers, multiple availability zones to increase the resiliency of your cloud-based workloads. We're going to talk about how AWS regions can be used and how you select an AWS region and how you have the option, regardless of where your customers are in the world, how you can select an AWS region that is close to your customers. And then lastly, we're going to talk about edge locations that help from a CDN or content delivery network perspective, how you can have AWS cache, let's say, a lot of your website content so you get faster performance and lower latency to your end users. Then the next section we're going to talk about are core AWS services, and this is going to make up a large portion of the test, of the exam. So we're going to talk about the different service categories, whether it's compute, storage, network, and database. We're going to talk about 3 different compute families, whether that is EC2, whether that is serverless. We're going to talk about load balancers. So we're going to talk about all the different compute services. Then we're going to talk about storage, so you are well versed in the different storage services, whether it's S3, Elastic Block Store, also known as EBS, Glacier, Snowball, Storage Gateway. So we're going to dig deep in a later module on all those storage services. Then we're going to dig into the networking services, concepts such as virtual private cloud, VPC, which is basically a virtual network you create on AWS. We'll talk about how security groups can act as firewalls within your network. We're going to talk about DNS and how that is incorporated into a service that Amazon calls Route 53. And then one more time, we're going to talk about virtual private networking and direct connect, just like we did in 3.2. And then lastly, we're going to talk about different database services, how you can run databases on a virtual server, how you can use their managed database service. And then we'll also talk about DynamoDB, their document storage. And we'll also talk about Amazon Redshift for, let's say, data warehousing and data lake support. And then in 3.4, we're going to talk about where can you go for technology support. So we're going to review for you how you can find best practices, white papers, various forums and blogs, all to help you stay educated on AWS. We're going to talk about how you sign up for AWS support and the various costs of those support levels. We're going to talk you through the partner network. So if you need a third-party company to help you with your AWS challenges, how you can find those. And then we're going to talk about other ways to get technical assistance and how to use the AWS Trusted Advisor. Now let's talk about the last domain. This is billing and pricing, and this was the least weighted section, but still important content to know here. First, let's talk about how you compare and contrast the various pricing models. So one pricing model is called on demand. That means you are not making any financial commitment. You are just going to pay for what you're using. Then we're going to talk about reserved instances, which mean you know you're going to use these resources for a period of time. You need these virtual servers. Not surprisingly, you get a discount if you commit that you are going to use these resources, say, for the next 12 months. And then we're going to talk about spot instances where you can set a price and say, if these virtual servers ever reach this low price point, then I want to be able to use those. So we're going to talk about those different pricing models available to you. Next, we're going to talk about the various account structures. And we're going to talk about how you can use a service called AWS Organizations. Most companies, when you start using AWS, you start with a single account. And for better or worse, that account contains dev, test, production workloads, but you quickly learn that that is not a best practice. You need some structure in how you manage accounts. You need to be consistent with how you apply guardrails and security services across those various accounts. And so we're going to walk through how AWS helps you to do that, as well as the best practices that have been established. Next, we're going to talk about resources available for billing support. So how do you get a handle around what your AWS costs are, and whether you're using the free tier or you're using $1 million a month of AWS services? You need a way to understand, what am I being charged for? Where are those costs accumulating? What services are contributing to my monthly bill? So we'll talk about tools such as Cost Explorer, the Cost and Usage Report, some third-party options, just so you better understand what is being billed in your AWS account. We're going to identify how you figure out what these services are going to cost before you deploy, not after. Things like the monthly calculator or the simply monthly calculator, how you can use product pages to understand their pricing. There's also an AWS pricing API. We're going to teach you how to recognize that you can set alarms and alerts so that you don't get hit with unexpected cost 30 days after that activity happens. So we want to set those alerts and alarms so you identify if there's an issue, you understand that the day it happens, not when the bill arrives. And then lastly, we'll talk about how you can tag your various resources. For instance, maybe you want to tag them based on a certain cost center so your business can understand what the different business solutions are costing them. Maybe you want to tag that whether it's a development, a test, or a production resource. Maybe you want to assign those to individual customers that you support, and you want to understand what the cost of AWS infrastructure is in supporting your various customers. But those are the items that we're going to talk about in the last domain, domain 4, billing and pricing. Lastly, we're going to talk about the items that are out of scope. What do you not need to worry about when you take the Cloud Practitioner certification exam? Well, the first thing is coding. You don't need to write any code, which is good news. You don't have to be in front of the command line. They don't expect you to write infrastructure as code, so we'll save that for another day. Next, you won't be designing cloud architecture. Plenty of certifications will require you to do that, but this is the first certification exam, kind of the introductory exam into what AWS is all about, so you don't have to design any cloud architectures. You don't have to worry about troubleshooting scenarios. What happens if your server cannot connect to your database? So don't worry about any of those troubleshooting concepts. You don't have to implement AWS Cloud. This is, again, just about the concepts and some of the benefits of using the cloud. So don't worry about how you're going to implement the cloud. You don't have to worry about how to migrate, let's say, from a data center that is on premises to the cloud. You don't have to worry about load or performance testing environments, and you don't have to worry about business applications that Amazon has, such as Amazon Alexa or Chime. So just focus on the 4 domains, so the topics that I'm talking about. Follow along as we cover all of these domains in later modules, but keep in mind that all of the things listed here on the screen are things that you don't have to worry about until other certification exams. So we are at the end of this module. I want to thank you for watching. I'm going to show some of my other videos that are available here. As soon as Module 1, the follow-on to this course, is available, you will see that here. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your attention watching this, and I hope to see you soon.